Okay, last recording on needs here. We're going to go over some psychological needs. Probably not too surprisingly, in the field of psychology, this research on psychological needs is very extensive. And so we will certainly not be covering all of it. That just to say, for an example, we won't be going over self-esteem theory directly. So, if there is a psychological need that you're really interested in and that you know some about, but want to know more about, and we don't cover it here, definitely don't hesitate to reach out, and I can see what I'm able to find for more resources in terms of learning those other needs. But anyways, there are some core psychological or psychosocial needs, and these are all heavily researched today. Three of the most heavily researched are need for achievement. So this involves looking to expand your accomplishments and skills. There's the need for affiliation. And so this gets at that belongingness need that we brought up with Maslow. And then there's also a need for power involving wanting control, specifically control and authority over others. And so it's kind of important to think about which of these psychological needs, specifically these three, is the most important in terms of those first couple needs that Maslow brings up for survival and reproduction. And based on how you look at it, these can all be important for survival and reproduction. You need, achieving things will make it easier to have a standing in society, right, where survival and reproduction becomes more likely. Affiliation, belongingness, and being in social groups is very important for humans, and it certainly plays a role in things like reproduction. Power, if you have a lot of power and authority over others, then it should be easier to get those resources that are needed for survival. And so when thinking about these things in terms of survival and reproduction, they don't seem all that different, but they are in the psychological research realm, they are treated separately. So this need for achievement, we already talked about the TAT a little bit. This does include a need for achievement score. And so this is a specific picture that you will typically see need for achievement type responses to. And so scoring the TNT in this area involves explicit reference to a standard of excellence, exceptional performance, or a long-term goal. And while I briefly brought up these projective tests potentially having some issues, there also seems to be some evidence for the validity of these scoring. And so those who score highly in that way on the TAT, or in other words, demonstrate high need for achievement, perform better in a variety of areas. A specific example is anagram tasks. So unscrambling words in a 2-minute period. Those who are high in need for achievement just in general did better, completed more anagram tasks. And you see this especially over time. So those high in need of achievement will show much higher persistence as time needed for that task goes on. However, interestingly, there seems to be more than just the need for achievement group that comes out of this TAT scoring. And so there are actually two groups that can be formed from answers involving explicit reference to a standard of excellence. So this involves two groups that are split based on answering need for achievement type things in either a positive or a negative way. So one of those ways, positive way, involves hope for success. This is more of an approach oriented perspective. And this is what we typically think of when we're thinking of need for achievement. And so, yeah, this is associated with the need for achieve, activity directed towards a given goal, having anticipation of success, being praise oriented, and explicitly mentioning examples of success. The flip side of that, or the other group, is a fear of failure group. This is so also can be known as a test anxious group in the realm of academia. This is more of an avoidance mindset or perspective on achievement. And so this involves avoiding failures. And so behaviors are typically going to be directed at avoiding any evaluation that might lead to failure. When those evaluations are happening or when they can't be avoided, there's often an anticipation of failure, rebuke orientation, and when coming up with examples for like on the TAT or whatever it might be, this typically involves mentioning failures. So, want to emphasize some differences that we see in these two groups. And so, I want to, first of all, just make it clear that I'm definitely not trying to point any fingers or make anyone feel bad if you're text anxious. That's okay. A lot of people are. And additionally, these are more like, I know I'm talking about them in terms of two groups, but these are more like two spectrums. So I think everyone has a certain level of need for achievement and test anxiety, and then it's just a matter of where you are. But I just want to present some research that suggests that potentially slowly trying to move away from test anxiousness might be of benefit. And so in this first study here, this is just a ring toss game. So something you might see at a fair, you just have the ring, you try to toss it so that it lands over this pole shaped thing. And participants were able to choose how close they were to the target. And so obviously if you're closer, it's easier. You can literally just put it on the thing. So it's just, that's the x axis here is just feet away from the target. And then they separated everyone into groups based on high or low need for achievement and test anxiety. And so I just want to point out a couple of things here. So we have this high need for achievement, low test anxiety group. We see that this group was typically kind of in the mid range here of tossing the ring in terms of distance. And so, yeah, y-axis is just percentage of shots. And so this high need for achievement, low test anxiety group was in the middle here, suggesting that they were interested in actually getting a good evaluation of how good they were at this ring toss game, right? If it's too easy, that's not really much of an evaluation. If it's too hard, everybody fails. That's not much of an evaluation either. So yeah, trying to actually gauge whether they're achieving at this task, how good they are, versus this low need for achievement, high test anxiety group, right? We see a higher percentage of shots taken in this group at either really close distances or really far away distances, as opposed to this first group I talked about. And so the idea is that this low need for achievement, high test anxiety group is looking to completely avoid those evaluations, right? Looking to avoid evaluation of I'm just bad at this ring toss game and I failed at it. And so sure, a pretty high percentage relatively is from a far distance. So yeah, that's probably leading to a lot of failures, but everybody fails at that distance. So it's not too much of a problem. It's still not too it's not a very good diagnosis, or doesn't include much diagnostic information of how good you actually are at the game. And then this is just so easy, right? Looking to just have pretty much a guaranteed success to avoid that failure. Additionally, there are differences in these two types of perspectives or orientations in terms of persistence when failure is possible. Um, and so, kind of emphasizing the importance of hope for success versus fear of failure. So, yeah, these two groups here. This is kind of a weird graph here because it includes actually 3 variables. So I just want to point that out. You have the two groups, the orientations here, right? And then you have showing either high persistence or low persistence. And then this percentage here, that's just task difficulty. So that's just a percentage of how many people on average will successfully complete the task. So 70%, that's going to be an easier task relative to this 5%, which is a very hard task. And so with the success-oriented individuals, it seems like these people are persisting when it makes sense to do so. So in other words, when there's a decent but not a guaranteed chance of success, right? We see high persistence in that success-oriented group, but we see the opposite in the failure-oriented group, where there's more persistence actually for this really hard task that, again, includes less diagnostic information about ability or actual achievement, because basically everyone, 95% are failing this task. And you see, a lot less persistence here for the success oriented when success really just isn't possible. This kind of idea of these different outlooks, orientations applies to many different areas. One area that I'm personally really interested in that I'll mention it a couple times in the future, but it won't spend too much time talking about it, is the growth mindset. And I don't want to go on too much of a tangent here, but this is something that I've included in my own research, and I think it's really interesting. So basically what the growth mindset is, it applies to many different areas, but its origin is in learning. And so with the growth mindset, those with the growth mindset have more of an idea that intelligence is malleable and can change over time, versus those with more of a fixed mindset believe that, okay, I'm at this level of intelligence and it's not going to change. So I can either, I can do what I can do right now. Everything I can't do right now, it's not going to get any easier for me. I'm not going to be able to do that. And so the importance, again, without me talking for too long here, is that this has quite a large impact seemingly on learning and performance. And so those with a growth mindset aren't going to be as fearful of failure, right? They're not going to have much of this failure orientation, because failure is a part of growth. And that's not, the idea is that intelligence is improving. So if I practice this, I can get better over time, and I just need to put in effort, versus fixed mindsets like, well, shoot, I failed at this. This is diagnostic information of me just being bad or having low intelligence or whatever that might be. So then you see more, things like persistence with this growth mindset, and then eventually higher performance and scales like GPA and things like that. So I'll stop talking about it now. If you want any more information on that, just let me know. Self-handicapping is something that we'll go into more later on in the class. This will be kind of more of its own section per se. And basically those who are failure oriented, have this fear of failure, tend to use more self-handicapping. Self-handicapping is just various behaviors to, in a sense, take away the blame of failure. It's certainly not a scientific definition, but an example is like drinking the night before a test, so that, if you go into that test and fail it, you can just be like, oh, that wasn't me. I just made that poor decision, or I made that decision to go drink, and it's because I drank that I failed this test. It's not, that's not diagnostic information of me or my intelligence or anything like that. Anyways, there are certainly other modern theories of these psychological needs as well. So one is optimal distinctiveness. This gets at that belongingness idea. And so basically here we can have too much distinctiveness or not enough belongingness, like this person out in the middle of nowhere by themselves here. Certainly we might enjoy that sometimes in terms of going on a hike or whatever, but doing this forever, likely not our favorite thing as humans. Here too, this is an Ohio school, which typically is not doesn't include very many Michigan fans. So this would be too much distinctiveness, and then there's also not enough distinctiveness, or I don't know if too much belongingness is correct here. So I just stick with not enough distinctiveness, where you basically just one of a big crowd, not very much uniqueness or anything. So the idea here is that there's a middle ground between belongingness and uniqueness, where we want groups of a small to medium size, where we start getting more of this belongingness, but then uniqueness without taking away too much of this uniqueness, which we also like. And oftentimes, certainly not always, but oftentimes groups that are kind of in this small to medium, but not too small, not too huge range, includes families and friends. Epistemic needs, another more modern theory here, is a need for closure. And so this gets into the desire for confident knowledge. Again, this is kind of a control thing where we don't like having uncertainty. A lighthearted example is when we're watching shows, we oftentimes, especially as we're getting close to the end, really want to finish it because we want to know what happens. I need closure with the show. How's this going to end? We can certainly see situational and individual differences here. So one person's need for closure might depend on the situation, but then one individual might just in general have more of a need for closure than a different individual. This involves two main parts. The first is seizing. So oftentimes we'll just grasp on to an initial area or form of evidence, and we give precedence to this initial evidence, especially when it's consistent with an initial idea or hypothesis that we had. And then we freeze with this initial information, and we are reluctant to consider information that suggests something else than the initial information that we have, because then this adds uncertainty, takes away from that closure that we want here. Or in other words, we don't want to change our minds. So for an example, if you're going to go and get dinner with friends or family or a date night or something, it can oftentimes take some time to pick a restaurant, at least if you're me. But then, eventually you do need to pick something, right? A restaurant needs to be picked. You need to have closure on which restaurant you're going to go to so that you can go eat. And then we oftentimes don't once we've made that decision, we're not huge fans of something changing where we end up having to go somewhere else or whatever. We like just sticking with that initial plan. For an example here, think about this in terms of apartment search. So quickly pause the video, imagine you're looking for an apartment, and each of these apartments is going to differ in rent size, parking, utility cost, and closeness to university. And if you want to think about this more, just pause, but I'll continue on. So here is, now it's decision time. So look through these, pause the video again really quickly and think about, weigh these different things. Think about which apartment you would like to have most. All right, so typically there's a wide variety of answers to which apartment people want, and it kind of depends on the reasoning. So there are all sorts of different reasons that you can use here, right? So one reason might be rent. So if you just want the least amount of rent, you might pick A. If you don't care about rent much, then you might start focusing on a different um, aspect of information here. But then ask yourself, did you actually use all 5 categories of information, or did you pick one area like rent and then just stick with that, not really want, you wanted that closure, didn't really want additional information? So for an example, if you picked apartment A, that might be the case where you just potentially just focused on rent, because as you see here, when you look at utilities, the cost is going to even out, right? So they're both going to end up being the same price, but apartment B is actually closer to the university, which is usually seen as better. So then they end up having the same price. One's closer to the university, so then apartment B might be thought of as better here once all of that information is thought of. Last slide here, need for closure in groups. We also see that high need for closure can have maladaptive influences in certain areas. So when there are more individuals in a group, that, like, think of a work environment, when there are more individuals in this work environment and the staffing group that have need for closure, members will often push for uniformity and quick decisions. And so this want for closure, quick decisions, uniformity is going to stifle creativeness, which can be important for coming up with the best way of doing things. And that's just what's shown here. So high need for closure. This actually, NFC can also often be thought as need for cognition, which is another psychological need that we won't talk about. But in this case, need for closure is associated with increases in conformity pressure, and then that conformity pressure leads to decreases in that group creativity. All right, and that is it for needs. Please, as I mentioned, let me know if you want any extra information on any needs that maybe I didn't get a chance to cover too much, and let me know if you have any questions.